Hello, my name is Nathaniel Walker, and today I'm going to be talking about postmortem staining and its effects on embalming. So, by definition, postmortem staining is the discoloration of the human body that is a direct result of hemolysis or the breakdown of erythrocytes. So, in other words, it's the breakdown of red blood cells. And these blood cells enter the tissues and eventually cause staining, such as in this example here. So, as we can see here, we can see this individual here on the left has quite a bit of staining in his upper back area, as long as his along his sides as well, and a little bit in his middle back area. And then we can also see some staining as well on his face, in the cheek area, and some in the forehead. So with this example here, this is the early stages, but again, just an example of what the staining can look like. As well here, I also provided some more examples that we can look at. So here on this side, we can see some blood pooling here on the sides of his back, the lower half of his back here, and then the upper half as well. And then on this individual here, it's a little bit more extreme. So some blood pooling here in the feet, and then unfortunately we can see some necrosis as well in his toes and the bottom of their feet. So, lividity is another term that some kind of fields of study like to use for postmortem staining. And basically, what lividity is it's again this staining. So, the bluish purple discoloration of skin. And also with lividity, there's in the early stages what's called blanching, which is this white discoloration you can see in this example that I've provided here. And basically using the lividity, so the level of a purplish hue, as well as if there is blanching present, a pathologist can determine basically how long an individual has been deceased. So not so much relevant to us here, but the part here that is relevant is when we see that blanching has ended. So when this blanching ends, sometime between the 8-hour mark and the 12-hour mark is when we start to see some permanent staining or post-mortem staining in an individual. As you can see here, blood becomes fixed. So there are three changes in the human body that result in this staining. The first is called hypostasis. So hypostasis is the slowing of the blood in the vascular system after someone has passed. And as a result of this, this blood begins to pool in the lower parts of the body that are facing downwards due to gravity. And this is a physical change. So this is something that we could possibly reverse. Hydrolysis is the next kind of stage here, or type of change that happens in the human body that results in staining. So hydrolysis is a breakdown of water molecules that eventually breaks down the veins and tissues and arteries in the human body. And this is a chemical change. So this is something that is not reversible. And this pooling eventually enters into the tissues and begins to darken the actual discoloration we've begun to see with hypostasis. And the final and arguably the most important change that happens in the human body is hemostasis. So hemostasis is the breakdown of erythrocytes, or in other words, again, red blood cells. And this is a chemical change. So again, something that is not reversible. And this is kind of the last change that takes place in the human body before that permanent postmortem staining starts to take place there. So the steps to this permanent staining are as follows. So the first is the hypostasis. So the blood begins to pool, begins to slow down in the vascular system. We then move to livor mortis, which we'll discuss here on the next slide, but this is the early stages of discoloration in the human body. We then move to hydrolysis. So that's again the water breakdown, tissue breakdown, and vein breakdown. Then we move to hemolysis, which is again those red blood cells are being broken down and turned into heme, which is a substance that enters into the tissues. And then at that point, we have the postmortem stain. So that's the permanent staining there. And these three, the hydrolysis, hemolysis, and postmortem stain, are all chemical changes. So things that are not reversible. So when we talk about postmortem staining, a lot of times liver mortis is kind of compared to and contrasted, along with similarities, differences. So these two things are very similar. They're two different types of staining and two different parts of the staining process. So we'll just briefly go over those differences here. Liver mortis is the second step, as we've discussed, in the staining process, and it's intravascular. So what that means is it's taking place in the vascular system. So it's not leaving the actual veins. So it is a physical change, and it is reversible. And embalming is sufficient in most cases in order to reverse this process. On the other hand, we have postmortem staining, which is extravascular. So what that means is at this point, as I displayed in the previous steps, that heme, the kind of blood products, are leaving the actual veins, entering into the tissues, and then permanently staining. So this is a chemical change, and it is permanent. And unfortunately, embalming is not sufficient in order to kind of remove this staining here. So things like bleaching agents can be used, not necessarily successfully, but it can remove some of that discoloration. And then cosmetics can be applied to the top of the skin to cover that up. So this is an example of a way to tell the difference between liver mortis and post-mortem staining in an individual. So this is if you were looking at someone trying to determine if the staining would be permanent or not. So hopefully when you're doing this, you're using a glove like how it shows here in our safety procedures. But if you can see, this person is pressing a finger down on this individual's stain, and it's showing this blanching. So when you see blanching, when you apply pressure to an individual in the staining area and you see that, that means that they have not quite gone past the liver mortis stage. So that means at this time it is reversible during the embalming process. On the other hand, if you were to do this experiment here and there is no blanching, then that means that we unfortunately are in the postmortem staining stage, and most likely embalming will have no effect on that stain. So why is this important for embalmers to understand? Why is it important for us to understand why postmortem stains can affect us? So there's two different factors here. One is time is of the essence. So in other words, what that means is we are unfortunately on a clock time. As I showed earlier, there is a point of time, usually between the 8 and 12 hour mark, where that staining can eventually become permanent in certain parts of the body, and embalming is not always able to get those stains out. So as we wait longer and longer, the unfortunate reality of it is those stains may become permanent. And we need to be able to explain these consequences to a family of delaying that decision. Though we never want to rush a family into making a decision like this for their loved one, but it is something that they need to consider when making that decision, especially if we're having a viewing, which is the second part. So sometimes these stains can appear in obvious places such as the face, the hands, and the arms. So that's something a family needs to understand, that those things could be visible. Of course, we can do our best to apply makeup and other cosmetics in order to cover them up, but unfortunately they can be in obvious places, and that can affect viewing. And also, if a loved one, passes away on their face or on their stomach, that pooling may affect kind of visible areas of the body. And as such, it's also a responsibility as embalmers and funeral directors to make sure that our decedent is positioned on their back at all times at the funeral home to prevent this staining from occurring while they're in our care as well. Thank you so much for listening. That is the conclusion of my presentation.